Um, Bonjour, good morning, everybody. I hope you're all awake and ready to go and take on this day. I want to acknowledge, of course, Principal Dean and all of the other university officials who are here and maybe dropping by and observing this process. I want to thank you for inviting me to be part of the dialogue on climate justice and Indigenous people. An area that I think has been a major topic of dialogue within Indigenous communities, and particularly Indigenous young people, for the last number of years. And so I'll try to keep my remarks brief so we can have a question and answer session that I think everybody would probably want to participate in, or at least be more interested in doing than listening to an old guy talk. If you get me going on my motorcycle, and you're one of the first to mention the motorcycle as part of my introduction, I regretfully have to put it away for the winter. And so the motorcycle, which I call Nietzsche, and I said our good nights a few days ago, and parked it in the garage now, so and covered it up and go and check it every once in a while and make sure that she's okay. But yeah, it's getting a little cold here now. It's -4. It's going to go up to 10 degrees, I think, today. So I might be tempted to wheel it out and go for another spin, but since it's already been winterized, I don't think I want to do that, because rewinterizing those things is always a bit of a chore. More importantly, though, the issue of climate justice for Indigenous people, at least from an Indigenous perspective, is one that's really quite a prominent thing among young Indigenous people today. And I say that because my granddaughter, who's going to be 16 in April, is a part of an advocacy group of young Indigenous people in the city of Winnipeg, which has sparked several rallies taking on government ministers and government officials and provincial ministers to be more considerate of the impact of their decision making with regard to climate protection and climate justice. And there's not been many activities that they have not shown up at in order to voice their concern. So I remember when I was in the Senate, she called me one day and she said, Mushroom, that's our word for her grandfather, Mushroom, she said, I'm going to go and lead a bunch of students in a protest at Minister Carr's office. Is that okay with you? I said, you don't need my consent to go and protest. I said, just remember, don't damage anything and don't hurt anybody, but you have the right to protest. And so they went and occupied his office for a number of hours in order to bring to him his attention, and he was the environment minister at the time, their concern about the fact that not much was being done around climate justice and the impact of climate change on Indigenous peoples. And I was always struck by their theme, or at least the question that they always asked. They had T-shirts made up, and it said, "Will we always be here?" And that was their question. Will we always be here? And that was their concern, that the impact of climate change was going to be so drastic, particularly in our Indigenous communities, that they felt that the front line of the changes that we are seeing are affecting Indigenous people first. And when you look at some of the research that has gone on to this point in time, and let me say, incidentally, I think we are in very early stages of researching the issue of the impact of climate change on Indigenous people. But when you look at some of that scholarly work that's being developed, I think it certainly speaks to the fact that we need more scholarly work, but it also speaks to the fact that we have only now begun to realize that the changes that are occurring in particularly the North are having a negative impact on Indigenous people in those areas. And when you travel in the North, if you ever get a chance to travel in the North, at least read about those experiences of those who travel in the North and visit Inuit communities. One of the things that I was struck by when we were doing the work of the TRC was in traveling through some of the Inuit communities, and we visited about 23 Inuit communities in northern Canada. In almost all of the communities, they raised the fact of the impact of climate change on their communities. And of course, they live in the area of the country that is seeing the greatest change with the impact upon ice and the impact upon the weather, the impact upon the growth of what little vegetation there is. But the one thing they said was it's having a really significant impact upon the polar bears. And they said because when the polar bears migrate, they usually go past the communities and then they go out onto the ice and then they do their hunting out on the ice. But without the ice there, and large areas of the water that had not frozen over, and without the ice being there, the polar bears can't go out there. And so as a result, they travel around the bay or they travel along the land, and that's where the communities are. And so the communities are experiencing more and more interactions with polar bears in the North because of the impact of climate change upon the ice flows. And that's causing a lot of consternation because that has impact upon their ability to hunt, their ability to be safe in their communities. Whereas they say that they would only ever see the polar bears passing by and going out onto the ice. Now, the polar bears actually come near their communities, and they may stay near their communities in the hopes of catching something, a dog or even a human being, as part of their food supply. And so they say life has become more dangerous for them. And nobody seems to be doing anything about that. But as they all said, the only thing you can do is to try to make more ice for them. And how do you do that? And so they're very concerned about the impact of climate change in their area. The overall impact of climate change upon the world, of course, is part of a major dialogue going on in the international community. But one of the things that strikes me, and I've communicated this to government ministers, both in the past and recently, is that when they have international conferences on the impact of climate change and the goals of government, international government policies, and the setting of standards with regard to controlling the impact of climate change, that the one voice that is absent at the table is the Indigenous voice. And you would think that given the recognition that Indigenous people are the ones that are most connected to the land and have the first visible awareness of what the impact is on the land, that you would want to talk to them. In Northwest British Columbia, the Haida people have created a program. Miles Richardson was telling me about this program where they will hire students during the summer months who report to a council of elders, and those young people work for the summertime, and they go out in groups and they live on the land and they travel the land in Haida territory. And their responsibility is to come back to the elders and just tell the elders what they see. They were one of the first groups that commented to the elders, and the elders reported this to conservation officials or government officials. They were one of the first groups that commented upon the impact of the the beetle infestation that was destroying the trees in northern British Columbia. And their observation of that impact over a period of months and now a period of years has been recorded. And of course, we now see the devastation that beetle deforestation that has occurred in the north. And again, that's attributable partially to climate change, because that's part of the migration of those insects into that area and the lack of control efforts made to keep it from destroying the forest. And of course, as the trees are killed off, then that has a significant impact upon the resources that are available. And the lack of resources means that the economy in the north, in their particular community, is negatively affected. They can't harvest the trees because the trees now have been infected with this beetle infestation. But on top of that, by the time they get to where the trees are, that they would be able to harvest. The trees are badly damaged by the fact that they've been standing dead or fallen over because of this infestation, and so they can't be used for any lumber sale purposes. And they rely upon the lumber industry themselves. They have companies that harvest the trees and sell it to lumber companies, and they know how to harvest it in an appropriate way so that it doesn't have a negative impact upon the land. But now they're more and more limited by the infestation. And the other impact that they talk about, not just the Haida people, but generally in the north, we talk to the Cree people in northern Alberta, you talk to the Dene people in the Northwest Territories, you talk with the Cree people in the Hudson's Bay Territory. The one thing they will tell you is the impact it's having upon the water flows, the rivers, and that the rivers are changing their course. The rivers and the permafrost is beginning to melt, and so that has an impact on the soil, has an impact upon the earth and where they can travel and how they can travel. There, in northern Manitoba, there was a railway that was built to Churchill, and now that railway had to be abandoned by the company that originated it, but it was bought by the Cree tribes up there. But they're having difficulty because the permafrost upon which the railway bed is located is shifting, and it's constantly dropping. And so they have to figure out ways to maintain the rail bed. And northern communities rely upon rail. They don't want to have to rely upon air transportation to get their supplies in. They, as a result, are being impacted in their food supplies and their own ability to feed their people. And the costs of getting fresh meat into the north is astronomical. You can pay up to 400 times the price for a pound of steak in the north than what you would pay in the south. And if you can imagine trying to have a hamburger that costs down here would be a reasonable price to pay, but in the north it's so high that you can't possibly eat it. It just doesn't get there, and the costs of getting it there, because it's almost all by air travel, is having a really significant impact. But the other thing, the thing about all of that is that nobody is making an effort to address it. There's really very little in the way of government effort to work with Indigenous communities and Indigenous people to address those very basic needs. And what would those ways of doing things better look like? I think that's the question, and that's where we really need some more scholarly work. The negative economic impact of climate change is a very significant issue in the north. It's not just about seeing the land change. That's something that they talk about all the time, is something that they've witnessed. But the fact that is now having an impact upon their very survival, and their limited ability to migrate away from that to a richer area. In the past, the chiefs in northern Manitoba say that their elders tell them that they know stories, and there are songs about the people having to move because this has occurred in the times past. Sometimes it's been too cold and they have to move further south to get away from it, or sometimes it's been too warm and these kinds of changes have been observed and they have to move away from it. I said, but now we can't move. The government has limited us to staying upon this particular land, this particular reserve. We can't simply say we want to move our reserve down towards Winnipeg, because they can't do that. So their ability to find solutions is more hampered because of government regulation. And there's been very little in the way of studies around that and what are some alternative solutions to those kinds of issues. But as I was saying earlier, when you have those international conferences, the voices that are not present are the Indigenous voices, and they should be there because, excuse me, if you have a dialogue around what is the impact of climate change, most of the dialogue focuses upon populated parts of the country. Most of the dialogue focuses upon the impact in California, the impact in southern British Columbia, the impact along the border between Canada and the United States, or in other parts of the world in populated areas. But the first impact and the early impact is almost always in those unpopulated areas where Indigenous people are the ones who occupy and utilize the land and live off the land. And they will be able to share their experiences and give warnings far earlier than we are able to get now, than we are using now. And that voice needs to be present at those conversations internationally. But in order to justify that, of course, I think we need scholarly work, which will be able to document that experience, document the fact that those voices have legitimacy. It's not just the fact that they have teachings about being connected to the land and their responsibility for the earth and all of that. That's very important. But it's also about the real impact upon their lives in language that Southern economic leaders would be able to recognize and would likely more strongly react to. And so that's where I think having an Indigenous presence at those international dialogues around the impact of climate change and the solutions to climate change are going to be very important. Right now, when they talk about solutions to climate change, it's about what can they do to protect the interests of the resource exploiters, and that is the lumber companies, the mining companies, the oil companies. And it's not about the people who live on the land in the north. It's about the people who are taking resources from the land, and they're also having a negative impact on the land. They're not necessarily solely a climate change problem, but they are contributing to climate change problems through their resource exploitation. They are also damaging the earth, and they are weakening the earth's ability to respond to the issues that need to be taken into account. So I think that question that my granddaughter and her group are always asking, will we always be here, is becoming more and more legitimate question. And from an Indigenous perspective, I think it's more serious than many people are yet prepared to recognize. So understanding how Indigenous people dealt with land issues in the past and understanding those teachings and the connection to the land teachings and the stories about the the responsibility for all of creation, I think is also part of what a scholar should be looking at. I don't think you are able to present a full picture. I was part of a discussion group when I was in the Senate, which was actively looking at changing legislation to give legal rights to animals and to land. You may or may not know in South America, I believe, and maybe I think in New Zealand, recently were laws that were passed that recognized the right of a river to legal status. And so that what that meant was that you couldn't negatively affect the riverbed. You couldn't negatively affect the flow of water in a river without, first of all, accounting for the rights that the river has to existence. And that's legal rights for their animals, legal rights for land, I think is an important dialogue, because that arises as well from understanding what those teachings are about, and understanding as well the view of creation, the view of all of the areas around us and what role they play in our lives and our responsibility for creation. And I think we need to understand them. I want to give some time for Q&A, so I just want to make a general comment about the involvement of Indigenous people in legal proceedings as well. The one thing that that I've always commented upon is that when we see Indigenous people protesting the use of their land for resource exploitation, whether it's the taking of resources from the land, or it's the building of pipelines across their land, or the taking of lumber from their land that they traditionally had, we need to recognize that they do have a legitimate right to claim that this is their land and that it has not been properly treated for. In many places, of course, there are treaties, and in those treaties, one could argue that the government negotiated for the right to take the resources off the land. But when you look at the treaty negotiations, the promise that was made by the government was that we would only bring settlers. We want the land and just for settlement. They never said we want the land in order to be able to send, mining companies to take the gold out of the land or take the resources from the land. So that was an absent part of that dialogue. So one could argue that that was not intended to be included in the treaties. But more importantly, in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the British Crown, as a legal commitment, and that law is still valid today, as a legal commitment said, Indigenous people have the right to control and maintain sovereignty within their territories, and that the British Crown will not allow any entry into their lands without their consent. So consent is needed. And I have been critical of judges who have, without question, issued injunctions to prevent Indigenous people from stopping resource exploitation on their land without asking the question, has their consent first been obtained, and how has it been obtained? And from a scholar's perspective, that's probably more of a legal scholarship question, but still, it has implications for resource development, and it has implications for the ultimate impact that resource development is going to have on the climate. So their ability to control that question and to influence those decisions through the use of law is also something that I think scholars should be considering. All in all, it's going to be an interesting dialogue that my granddaughter and her friends are going to keep waging, and she she knows from having been through ceremonies, having been taught by elders, and having participated in much of these conversations with me. She knows that she not only got a battle on her hands, but she also knows that she's in the right. And so she's not going to give up. I'll leave it at that. And I'll throw the floor back to whoever the floor controller is.
Yes, I'll take that. I'll take that, Chancellor Sinclair.
Okay.
I have that role today, so thank you very much for that. What I'm going to ask is, I noticed there's a couple of people want to ask you a question already. So when I ask you, if you can please turn on your microphone, ask your question direct. So thank you very much. So Wendy Webster, if you would like to go first, please.
Thank you, Colette, and thank you, Honorable Sinclair, for your inspiring and very focusing talk. I'm an infectious disease scholar. I attempt to be a scholar, and I work with Janice Hill and a number of people across the country on what is a disastrous situation for tuberculosis, primarily amongst Inuit, but Manitoba, they have children dying of tuberculosis meningitis, which shouldn't happen in Canada. And so healthcare, I didn't really hear much of a healthcare piece, and I think really I guess what I'm trying it belongs in the conversation. And even with COVID now, we have the capacity to diagnose a number of acute infectious illnesses. I think most communities across the country should have some diagnostic capabilities in their communities, and being able to work together to help the communities, which is really what's come out in our research, is that the communities need the data. They need to know what the cultures show. The cultures get lost in laboratories. We can tell a lot about how tuberculosis is transmitted using new tools, genetic tools, but they get stuck in the interprovincial, interfederal challenges. So I'll stop there, but I guess, I hope to be able to talk with you soon personally, but I would like healthcare to be somewhere connected with the conversation and get your advice on how.
All right, well, that's a very important topic. My mother died of tuberculosis, and I have always tested positive when I do the tuberculosis skin test. And so it's obvious that this is still part and parcel of our lives. And that's true for many people in the Indigenous community. So having an understanding of the impact that climate change is going to have upon the transmissibility of disease is really quite serious. In fact, in the North, you may or may not know that in some communities, the willingness of Indigenous people to get vaccinations is not because they don't believe in prevention, don't believe in taking the medicine that's being offered. It's that they're waiting for their healers, they're waiting for their medicine people to give voice to what else they need to do. I was in one conversation because the Indigenous Indigenous COVID team, I forget what the exact name is, asked me if I would be part of a promotional tour and to talk to Indigenous communities. And I remember one elder saying, I don't know how they expect to heal us when none of them know what the healing dance is. And that's an interesting issue, because when you heal the person, you always heal the body, the mind, and the spirit. And so they said, I want to know what their healing dance is. They can't just come and stick a needle in me. I want to know what their healing dance is. So it's an interesting perspective. And I think once once that approach is understood, then it becomes an easier dialogue. But you're right, it's a complicated question, so I'll be glad to discuss it with you Monday.
Thank you for that question. And so next I'd like to go question from Wanda Costin, please, or Dean Costin. Thank you.
Good to see you, Chancellor Murray. I was really impressed with this notion of the connection between climate change and supply chain. And of course, I'm coming from a business perspective, so apologies for that. But the real key question I have is there's a legitimate concern, an appropriate concern about inundating Indigenous communities with our scholarly research inquiries. But this is timely. So what might be some recommendations you have for how scholars might engage with Indigenous communities to get some input in there and involve them in this with a collaborative approach? Thank you.
Yeah, it is. It is an area in which you have to be careful because in the Northwest Territories, as you may or may not know, Northwest Territorial government, which is largely represented by Indigenous leaders, they have a law which says you can't do research in the communities without getting a permit from the Indigenous-led government. And so, and it's because researchers have come in and taken advantage of Indigenous communities. Sometimes have done experimental work with Indigenous communities, and then left without sharing the result of that and having a full level of participation. So, so there's been that kind of experience that you have to deal with or recognize as part of the history of this. But what that really speaks to is the need for engagement from the outset. So Indigenous scholars have not had any problem working with Indigenous communities when it comes to wanting to go and talk to elders, for example, about some areas of work that they're doing, like the medical community in particular. Excuse me. Their doctors, when they are looking at developing new approaches to the treatment of medical problems, they're smart enough to know that if they send in a representative ahead of time, who is a medical doctor, to sit down with the elders and with the leaders of the communities that they want to go into and just talk to them about what their needs are and to help meet those needs at the same time, and to show how they can meet their needs through this program that they're offering, will always have a much better reception than if you simply show up and park yourself at the local medical health center and say, all right, everybody come here. And so that doesn't work well. But also showing up cold without having some kind of introduction, having some kind of relationship develop ahead of time is never a good idea in any community for that matter. But in Indigenous communities, there is a basic distrust of non-Indigenous or white men's approaches to things, and that's based upon historical experience. So that has to be overcome, and there are ways that one can do that, and I'd be glad to share some of those when we have more time together. Okay.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Tina Dayson for a next question, please.
Great, thank you, Colette, and thank you, Chancellor Sinclair, for your wonderful insights this morning. Especially got me thinking about the topic of voice. So I recall a few years back being at a workshop that was hosted by a large NGO in Ottawa to look at the future of Indigenous education and helping children finish school and things like that. And I counted in the room that out of the 34 people there was one Indigenous voice. And so when you were speaking about voice, it really got me thinking of how do we ensure, I think the folks that organized the event had good intent, but poor execution. And so it makes me think about how do we ensure that there are pathways for voice and to be heard, because that's something very important that you raised this morning. And I think that we need to push for that much, much more, not just in Ottawa, but across community in Canada, of how we enhance that. So I wondered if you had any thoughts for how we could enhance voice.
Well, I've done two major inquiries in Canada, one the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry from 88 to 91, and the other the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And both of those inquiries involved going into communities and bringing community members forward to talk to us. And so I have a bit of experience in terms of planning how to facilitate that, how to help make that happen. And it does require a lot of preparation. You do have to be sure that you work with the community and that the community understands exactly what you're doing, exactly what you're asking for or looking for. And you have to engage with them in the development of the approach. And so as an example, when we did the AJI, the Justice Inquiry back in 88, 90, we were one of the first communities. The other major inquiry that had done that, incidentally, was the Thomas Berger Pipeline Inquiry in the Northwest Territories. And so I drew upon that experience, and I had some discussions with Justice Berger about how he did that and why he did things in a particular way. But we developed an approach in which we engaged with Indigenous people who had a connection to the language and to the community. Whether it was a distant connection or not, didn't really matter. But we asked them to go in to the community ahead of time and to meet with the leadership within the community, whether that was the chief and council or the people who were working in the justice field, who worked with the court systems or worked with the police systems, or just people generally who would want to share their concerns if they felt they had a safe place to do that. And so sometimes our staff, preparatory staff, would be in the community for a week or two before we would go in as inquiry commissioners. And I think that it involves developing that relationship of trust and then communicating, utilizing the network within Indigenous leadership. And that means speaking to national conferences and speaking to leaders at a national level to ensure they understand that they can trust you. And the word does get out there that by the end of both of those inquiries, we were getting communities who were sort of demanding almost that we come and see them. And so we accommodated as many of those as we could. In Manitoba alone, we visited over 100 communities. And when we did the TRC, altogether between the three commissioners, I personally visited over 600 communities in Canada. But altogether between the three of us, we visited over 1,500 communities. And they were very willing to participate with us. And it really does involve doing the necessary preparatory work and working with the people who know the community, and then having them become like your envoys to help get you in the door, so to speak.
Thank you for highlighting the importance of trust and credibility. I think that's really powerful because it's important to then build that momentum that you need.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, what's happening? Whoops. Sorry. Tara, quick.
I think Laura Murray has a question.
Thank you.
Hello, Laura.
Hello, thank you so much. I was so grateful for all the things you were talking about. And one of them that flew by, I just wanted to go back to, was the idea of animals who are not humans and land as persons. And I guess I'd add water too. I'm sure that would be in your mind. And it's such a powerful cultural and spiritual idea. And I just wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more about either its potential in the legal realm or just examples of it that you think would be worth, I don't know, learning more about and thinking more about.
Yeah, I think it's a whole new area of study. And there's quite a bit of scholarly work that's taken place in the international level. In the United States, there's a number of scholars who've written about this, and Australia and New Zealand, I've read some of their scholarship as well. And I think it's really a fascinating, from a lawyer's perspective, it's a really fascinating conversation to have. And I raised the issue in debate in the Senate on one occasion, and of course, not everybody, that's not fair. Many people poo-pooed the idea, and they said, "Oh, how could an animal or how could a river?" I mean, that was one reaction. How could a river have legal rights? It doesn't really have a personality. It's not really a person in the classic sense. And my response to it was, well, neither is a corporation. And yet we have no difficulty giving a corporation legal status and legal rights because it's a legal fiction. We're in effect utilizing the law in the best way that we can to create obligations, not necessarily creating rights for the river, but creating obligations for the people. And what we're saying is you can't do this to the river, just like you can't do this to the corporation without recognizing that that corporation has legal rights and legal status, and somebody can stand up and sue you on behalf of the corporation. So anybody could stand up and sue you on behalf of the river, arguing that you've interfered with its legal rights and its legal existence. And I think when you kind of bring it into the realm of language that people are sort of familiar with, then it begins to make sense. The first reaction is almost always, what a stupid idea. Are you an idiot? Are you working on being an idiot? Or do you naturally come by that talent? So I would say that it's been a really interesting debate. And it's one that I enjoy having because I just love debating with people.
Well, also just to kind of disrupt the idea that the idea of property is a kind of normal or obvious thing as well, is all part of that. Thank you so much.
Well, I always told, I have 3 dogs here, and I think Patrick has about 117 dogs. I have 3 dogs here, and I always tell them that your rights are always subject to my rights. So we have an understanding. They know where they stand. But they also have an advocate in my wife. She's a better lawyer than I am. The only legal argument I've ever lost. Anyone else want to?
Yeah. Oh, come on.
Raise an issue? Come on.
Might have time for one more question.
Okay.
Valerie, would you like to ask a question? And then we'll turn it to Brittany to thank the Chancellor.
Thank you very much. Chancellor Sinclair, we have a dog too. I think his rights supersede my rights as a golden retriever. I'm wondering if you could speak to the intersection of art and climate change. I'm actually speaking to you from my studio in Ottawa. And you haven't had the opportunity yet to touch on the role that art can play, quite frankly, in telling the story of climate change. And I'm wondering, especially with the wonderful Indigenous artists out there, I'm thinking of Shelley Nero, for example, if you could speak to the role that art could play.
Well, actually, I just had this conversation with a friend of mine who is a musician, and we were talking about the potential impact that music could have upon understanding climate impact. And I said to him, if I had the musical ability to do so, I would write a song from the perspective of a river. I would write a song in which, as a river, as a water, I was talking to the people. And he said, that is both brilliant and impossible. So I said, well, that's what makes it worth trying. So I think that would be the challenge, how to bring that voice forward, how to bring that that perspective forward, and to think about if you were a tree, if you were a river, if you were the land, and you wanted to communicate to the people, how would you do that? It's my name, my Indigenous name is Mzenegijik, and that name means the one who speaks of pictures in the sky. And there's a long story about it, but the story partially is about how this young man learns from all of creation around him how to communicate with the Creator through the images that are in the sky, and that the Creator is communicating to him by sending those images. And that isn't just the clouds, which of course everybody thinks about. It's also about the shapes that the animals take when they fly, and the direction they fly, and the way they move in the sky. And so I would say that, if I were an artist, I would try to tell a story from the perspective of the of creation, from the perspective of the environment, and paint a picture that way. What does the water think when it is replenishing you? What is the water trying to do, and what is the water thinking when it's taking care of the fish and the other creatures of the water? And what does the mountain think when it's standing there and people are digging into it? I think there are ways of reflecting on this. You just kind of have to let your mind go a little bit and try and get beyond your limitations that your educational experience has imposed upon you. But there are ways of thinking this through that are inspirational. And I remember my granddaughter again, when she was little. She said, "Musham, could you explain the wind to me?" And I said, "Well, okay, let me try." And so I tried to explain not how the wind was created through, changes in air pressure and stuff, but I tried to explain to her why we had wind. Why do we need wind? What is the purpose of wind? And so at the end of it, she said, "Well, you tell a really good story. I like that story." So, but it inspired her to think about things, and that's really what we're trying to do here. And so it's just that we need to open up our minds a bit about if you were thinking about this as part of that creation from that perspective, how would you reflect it in art? That's what I would do. And it's like there are forces that come to bear upon you that are negative forces, but there are also forces that come to bear upon you that are wonderful forces, that are very gentle forces, and you want to maybe give that image as well, and maybe at the same time in the same piece of art.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful and, quite frankly, especially inspiring. I've just come back from a photo shoot in Outport, Newfoundland, thanks to funding from the School of Graduate Studies. And I'm actually looking at issues from the perspective of the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah.
So thank you so
There you
much. This is just lovely. I really appreciate it.
Good.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite Brittany to thank the Chancellor.
I know I speak for everyone here when I say that we were inspired by your thoughtful address this morning. Something that really resonated with me was your comments on approaching scholarship through the lens of our responsibilities to creation and the teachings of our original instructions. And I also agree that the lack of inclusion of Indigenous voices within discussions on the impacts of climate change and potential solutions is really detrimental and is an issue that needs to be addressed. So with that, Chancellor Sinclair, on behalf of the Office of Indigenous Initiatives and the School of Graduate Studies and all the guests here today, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to participate as our keynote speaker at the annual Indigenous Research Collaborations Day. Nyawagua.
Very good. Thank you.